Is better than the support gem, but I just wanted to get the support gem so I remember. Alrighty, start again. G'day, Ziggy D here, and welcome to my skill gem analysis and first impressions for the brand new skill gem, Molten Strike. Pretty awesome looking skill. It's one of the most visceral ones that's been added in a while. I also think it's one of the most interesting and kind of complex skills. One of the coolest and most interesting skills that's been added in a while. That said, with my testing today, I've not been able to make it very effective. But that's okay. New skill gems get introduced to the game, and you kind of take a while. It takes a while before you can build builds and create ideas around them to make them super effective. Sometimes you get skill gems that right away you can just slot into your build and they just work straight up. But something like this, I think, is going to take a bit more careful building. And on this character today testing, I've not been able to make it more effective or even close to as effective as Infernal Blow. So I'm using my Ziggy D Anarchist, which is my heavy metal Infernal Blow Marauder. So you guys have probably seen it's a pretty effective build and it works well with Infernal Blow. But Molten Strike just by itself doesn't seem all that great. Now I'm currently using it unsupported, but I'll show you guys some of the different support gems and how it works. But you can see the basic idea of the skill is that it is a physical and fire damage attack that has an initial point of impact, like a lot of other attacks. And then it has a bunch of projectiles that go out and deal small AoE damage that is, again, physical and fire as well. So it's actually very similar in nature to Lightning Strike in that it's a melee attack that then has a secondary projectile effect. However, whereas Lightning Strike travels out in straight lines and can be modified in a few different ways, Molten Strike works in a little bit different. It travels in an arc, comes down, and then explodes on the spot. So it has an AoE at the end of that point. And the ways that you actually modify it end up being a little bit different. I guess it makes the same then, Lightning Strike, Molten Strike, sort of going both directions there, and it's a natural addition to the game. Now, let's take a basic look at the skill gem here before we get into the support gems and the ways you can build for it. It is a fire projectile attack AoE melee skill. Now, you'll notice it doesn't have any specific weapon requirements, so you can use this on daggers, go for a crit build if you want. You can use it on swords, axes, maces, claws. Finally, another AoE skill for claws, so that's a pretty good idea. If you've been trying to make a claw build, maybe this will be one that you get into, and also just another nice AoE for dagger builds as well. So, melee skills getting some more AoE love, which is always good to see. So, naturally, as a projectile skill, you can modify the projectiles in a number of different ways, and as an AoE skill, you can modify those things in a number of different ways as well. Skill gems that put together projectile and AoE can get pretty interesting. And certainly that is the case with this. So let's just go through some of the different skill gem choices, and I'll tell you things that I think are good, things that work, things that maybe you can try in your build, and things that don't work so well. So let's talk about basic damage modification for now. So first up, I'm going to look at things like weapon elemental damage and added fire. Now, weapon elemental damage is a fairly good choice because this is a 60% conversion of physical to fire. So it's a good percentage of the skill is fire damage. Now, if you're also using something like the Hatred support, like the Hatred aura, then you'll be able to scale pretty well through weapon elemental damage. And indeed, in my case, I get more damage from weapon elemental damage than I do from something like added fire. So 2,000 damage there with added fire, 2,200 with Molten Strike. But depending on your build, weapon elemental or added fire may be better. Now, I do think because this skill has the ability to be used with GMP and things like that, that it can be used in a purely elemental build, using things like GMP and weapon elemental damage, and not using stuff like added fire or physical scaling. So that is an option as well. I do think it is viable for elemental skills because you can get the number of hits quite high. So there's the basic damage scaling things. Just pick whichever one is better for you, obviously, and that's going to very much come down to your build in the end. Now, as a projectile skill, it can be modified with both LMP, so this increases the number of projectiles by 3, and GMP to increase it even further, and you can see the number of projectiles there is pretty nice. Now, because this is an AoE, more projectiles means more overlapping of the AoE, means more potential hits on the same mob. So, for example, 3 projectiles landed right there. In fact, if there was a mob in there, it probably would have been hit by something like 6 projectiles. So the AoE gets pretty effective with GMP. It also increases the overall area that you're covering with it as well. And it seems like a pretty good choice. Now, because it's a pretty high fire damage skill, like a big proportion of your physical is converted to fire, I actually do think GMP is somewhat viable. The thing about GMP and LMP usually are that they reduce your per hit physical damage. Now, because of the way armor works in PoE, smaller hits of physical, smaller but more frequent hits of physical, mean that armor becomes more effective, so you deal less damage overall. But since it is a big elemental conversion, I actually think GMP is pretty viable, especially if you're also using something like Hatred. So I do think that is a pretty good choice. GMP is a pretty decent choice, and maybe LMP if you want to save some of your physical damage, be a bit more effective with physical. But both do a good job of increasing the number of hits and your overall AoE. So next up, we have Point Blank and Iron Grip. So these guys are ways of increasing the damage of the projectiles. There's a few other things I want to talk about with projectiles, but we'll get into that in a moment. But Point Blank does work, and it works really well. Now, this says projectile attacks deal up to 50% more damage at the start of their movement. However, it does deal that always, basically. These projectiles will never travel outside of point blank range. So, even if they go as far as they can, you're always doing 50% more damage. Now, the drawback to that is obviously reduced attack speed, so you may need to build around that, and maybe you don't like the reduced attack speed much, but a 50% more modifier on the projectile damage is pretty incredible. So I think Point Blank's actually a really good support gem. Now, Iron Grip is another good example here. If you're high strength build, it's going to be able to increase the projectiles, just the same as with Lightning Strike, but I recommend using the Iron Grip Keystone over the support gem in pretty much all cases, because there's no drawback to the Keystone, whereas there's a reduced attack speed on the support gem, so I wouldn't use that. Also, it takes a support gem slot. Now, things like Fork and Chain and Pierce, none of those work. The way this skill works is it travels up and then hits the ground and then does an AoE. So because it hits the ground, there's nothing, it can't chain, it can't fork, none of that will work. It's not worth using or even trying any of those. So, now let's talk about the idea of these projectiles and combine them with the AoE tag. The AoE tag, as I said, these things get pretty interesting. So let's say we're using GMP. We've got a large number of projectiles here. We cover a pretty good area. Now, Conk Effect, I think, is a really, really good choice for this skill. And in fact, I'd say probably one of the mandatory support gems. And what Conk Effect actually does is, in addition to increasing the damage, so, you know, your 52% more area damage, so the AoE of these projectiles will be dealing more damage, it also reduces the clustering. So you can see while using this that the clustering is more consistently just in front of me and in a small AoE. What this means is that by the nature of the hitboxes on mobs, you're going to be hitting mobs with a lot more projectiles much more frequently, much more reliably. So both the fact that you're increasing the damage of the projectiles and hitting the same mobs with more of the projectiles, I think in Conk Effect is a fantastic choice for this skill. Now, you can also use increased AoE. I was using my Mirari Urki earlier, and this will increase the AoE of the projectiles, but it'll also make them spread more. So if you want more, I guess, group control, like you're trying to hit larger packs, you want to be maybe able to kite a little bit better in hardcore or something like that, then increased AoE is a decent choice. But I would say Conk Effect is probably the best choice overall. So it's a fantastic one. It's one I'd leave in. So now we're looking at something like, you know, GMP Conk Effect or LMP Conk Effect, or maybe none of those, and Conk Effect, still very good choices. Now, next up, obviously anything that affects melee skills will affect this, so multi-strike works just fine and is a decent choice, I think, as is faster attacks. Melee Splash I don't think is a very good choice. Melee Splash only makes the initial point of impact with your actual weapon strike splash, which adds an AoE effect to non-AoE melee skills, but since this is already an AoE melee skill, I don't think Melee Splash is worth using. It feels like a bit of a waste of a support gem slot. I think the main focus should be on scaling the projectiles as much as possible. Other things that don't work include slower and faster projectiles. Initially I thought that maybe you'd be able to increase or decrease the clustering with slower projectiles, so slower projectiles you would expect to make things a bit closer, but neither of these has a bit of a choice. I actually got this confirmed by Rory, one of the developers, and he said that, you know, with physics, the skill would look a bit weird with faster and projectiles and slower projectiles working well, so they didn't like it and they disabled that. Now, I'm pretty sure physical projectile attack damage does work. I haven't been able to test this too much. This doesn't seem to have a drawback as well. It does more increased physical attack damage, and the tag certainly adds to the skill. And so I'm pretty sure you're able to increase the base damage of the projectile, which is then converted to fire and scaled normally. So physical projectile attack damage seems like a good choice. But I haven't really been able to confirm how good this is just yet, but it's one maybe you should test out, test with your build and sort of see how that works. So my overall impressions are that this doesn't work very well in a build like this, in a slower attacking, more pretty good choice for this skill. I think it has a lot of potential. It's a very nice leveling skill, and at end game it's going to need a bit of careful focus on the projectile side of things in addition to fast attack speed. So I suspect something like Ranger picking up some projectile damage as well as picking up some like attack damage. Make sure you do avoid things like melee damage. These sorts of nodes won't affect the projectiles, so avoid those. But things like Mace damage, if you're using maces, will work fine. So take these things into account when building with this skill. I think it's pretty cool, and although I can't get it to work very effectively, I'm sure you guys will be able to do something cool with it. If you have any cool ideas, make sure to leave them in the comments below. But anyway, that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching. How you guys going? Please don't be mad if he doesn't answer you at the moment.